Local government plays a pivotal role in helping developers navigate obstacles like high construction costs and complex approval processes to build more housing. And in a city like LA, where there never seems to be enough housing, that role is becoming more and more important. Today, we dive into what it takes to turn housing plans into real, tangible projects and how city leadership can help clear the way for more construction. My guest, Jenna Hornstock, is a leader in housing policy whose career has been dedicated to untangling the complexities of development in one of the country's most challenging markets. Through her leadership at LA Metro, Southern California Association of Governments, and most recently as Deputy Mayor for Housing in Los Angeles, Jenna has reshaped the landscape of possibility for a city in constant evolution. So, what does it take for local government to work effectively with developers and drive meaningful change? And what lessons can other cities draw from LA's experience? This is Building Better Cities. I'm Kate Gasparo, and today we're about to find out. You have a long, long history of working on housing in Los Angeles, both the city and the county. You worked for LA Metro's TOD communities. You most recently were working for Mayor Bass as the Deputy Mayor of Housing. And that is a long and illustrious career in this space. But how did you get here and how did it evolve over time?
Yeah. It's interesting because I didn't know what urban planning or affordable housing or this whole space was actually until I was in graduate school. I was getting a master's in public policy. I started going to brown bags and trying to figure out what is out there in this space that matches what I liked. And I found urban planning, housing, and economic development. And I really liked the idea of doing policy work that you had the tangible result. And obviously with housing, you are bringing things into the built environment. And this is all overlaid with my desire to do public good. But that was why I was in policy school. I wanted the public good part of it. So I ended up cross-registering, taking some urban planning classes. I really wanted to do locally based housing and economic development work. I felt that at the local government level is really where you see it happen. I ended up doing some grant work for LISC, the Local Initiative Support Corporation. And then I worked for Mayor Hahn in 2002. That just propelled me out into the affordable housing world.
I love how you talk about the local aspects of housing, because right now housing has become such a national conversation, but at the heart of it are all these individual communities that are dealing with their own individual identities and what does it mean to provide housing to all different types of people. And LA has not been a stranger to this conversation at all. And you've sort of sat at the heart of that. What are some of the programs that you've worked on through your career? And maybe if you could touch on one that you felt the most proud of or has been most successful, and those could be different or synonymous.
Sure. I mean, going back to this focus and intentional desire to work in local government, there's so much power in local government. And I don't say that, I think, from a place of like, I must be powerful and control things, but there's just local government has the power to make things happen. Land use, financing, kind of working directly with community. I'm just grateful to have worked on amazing projects. A lot of times, particularly when you are staff in a public agency or even an executive at a public agency, which I've been both, you've got kind of the elected official offices pushing you to do an individual project or program. But how do you use that work to develop scale and infrastructure in the public sector, right? You can do a bunch of one-offs, but if you really want to create lasting change and scalable impact, you have to be able to scale programs. And importantly, there has to be infrastructure there for the public sector to do its work. I worked at LA Metro. I was the executive officer for transit-oriented communities, the first TOC program in the country, at least for a transit agency. And I took over managing our joint development program, right, which is where Metro partners with developers to get commercial development on its land.
Yeah.
When I came in, there was a lot of like one-offs, a project here and a project there, but not like a cohesive strategy. Many projects stuck. I came to learn stuck and in precarious places in terms of how they came to be. And we didn't have a clear framework for how we do our work. And so over the course of time, it took, a couple years, but where we landed was, we unstuck our stuck projects, which was a lot of work internally, but also with our community stakeholders and with board engagement. At one point in my tenure, I think we had 15 active projects going in a positive direction, and they're all moving. We updated our process for how we do joint development. Because when I came into the department, it was not clear to me how we did what we did. Like, how do you start a new project? All the legal and the programmatic documents, We launched a new joint development policy that had clarity about how we engage community, our racial equity values, as well as our affordable housing policies. And then we studied all of our sites, like what did we own and how did they come to be owned by us? What were the requirements? What are the opportunities for these sites so that we could prioritize a bit and be more thoughtful about how we move forward? And I feel like this is not maybe the most sexy stuff, but it's really impactful
Yeah.
for there to be clarity of process and transparency about what we're doing as a public agency.
So what I'm hearing, and a lot of people know this, is that housing is such a interdisciplinary field. And you're dealing with housing advocates, you're dealing with financing, you're dealing with community members, and it touches all these different spaces. But if you don't have clear process and if you don't set clear expectation, it's really hard to bring all those resources to the table and effectively deploy them. And that seems to be your superpower, is taking these overarching large missions and figuring out, okay, maybe it's not how do we get to the groundbreaking as fast as possible, but how do we set up sustainable processes and teams that can continuously ground break.
And I think it's really important. You hear the trope all the time about government is difficult, bureaucracy, process. Yes, government processes can be difficult and frustrating. And you must have them because you can't just hand out money to whoever asks or the project you like the most. Because on the flip side, there's corruption and perception of favoritism. And so it's really figuring out the balance of creating the right processes and bureaucracy that can still move swiftly, create fair and transparent processes so that there can be participation. You've got to have that back of house infrastructure. It's the rooted foundation in order to thrive and grow.
That's so important. And you're also saying that when you're working on joint development, which some people recognize as maybe public-private partnership office, that sense of clarity was essential to enticing and incentivizing private sector to not only come to the table, but invest their own resources in these projects.
Yes. Yeah, one of the best compliments I got when we rolled out our new form of RFP, but it was a negotiation with legal and procurement. These sections of the RFP reflect our standard. You must have this language. And as long as we don't touch that, we have freedom to develop the part that's like, what is this site? What do we want to see at this site? Which was driven by community engagement. Because we said, look, this is a sales document. An RFP is not a we're buying services. It's like we're selling our land, if you will, even though it's technically selling it. And I remember when the first one of this new standard RFP went out, when it came out, a developer friend that I'd known for a long time called me and just said, thank you. This is like the best RFP I've ever read. I understand what you're asking me to do. I understand what I need to provide. And I feel comfortable spending time and resources doing this. It was very gratifying to hear that we had achieved that goal quicker on our end and giving clarity to those who wanted to, come into that space.
Yeah, maybe if I could tie like a couple pieces together, like cities and counties and agencies like Metro own a lot of land that they can then incentivize developers come on board and help develop this vacant land in most cases, or dilapidated land, into new housing. In LA, experts say that there needs to be somewhere close to 56,000 additional housing units every year constructed, not just in the pipeline, but constructed to meet demand and drive down the cost of housing. And when you have vacant land that can be put towards those uses, that is a great tool. But I assume that there are lots of other tools in the toolbox. What is the agency's role in getting more housing deployed from the public sector side?
Part of what the agencies do is use your public land. And I do think that's really important, but I think you were getting at this writ large. Just developing the public land isn't going to address our housing crisis. It's how do we clear the path for the private sector to build housing. And when I say private, by the way, I mean for-profit and not profit. And so it's really important that the government can clear the path with its powers so that the building community can come in and build this housing. And so I think starting in on what some of these challenges are, because the government needs to help remove the challenges. Is California, and particularly Southern California for decades, has had this slow growth movement. I don't want to demonize homeowners, myself being one. It has been largely driven by homeowners who understandably feel like I've got my home. I'm afraid of my property values being affected. And our system is set up since your property value is how a lot of us give wealth to our offspring, right? Intergenerational wealth. And this slow growth movement was both that and also a lot of institutionalized racism or systemic racism, where people perceived that if you're building apartments or denser housing, it's serving those people, those lower income people, which we know because of our country's history tend to be people of color, our lower income communities. And the slow growth movement has just showed up in so many different facets, primarily, in our zoning and what you're allowed to build. I think on top of that, CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, which again started from a place of really good intention in terms of protecting our overarching environment as development happens, has really become a weapon, right? It's been weaponized in so many different ways.
Right.
But also the cost of entitling projects, the cost of doing CEQA analysis, the cost of been battling with attorneys, the appeals and lawsuits around that have really made it difficult writ large to build housing. And then we're going to layer on top of that, in LA City, for example, Prop U downzoned all commercial corridors in Height District 1, which is the vast majority of our commercial corridors in LA, would downzone to have a maximum FAR of 1.5 to 1. That happened instantaneously. Like, the amount of apartments you could build in LA just dropped. I think it went from serving 10 million people that we could with new housing to 4 million.
Wow.
In terms of our zoning capacity. And so layer all that, it's just been really expensive to build, and particularly to build apartments. Then you look at construction costs, right? But in my 20 plus years in this business, I have never remember seeing a statistic that construction costs have gone down. It's just a persistent, going up. And then land values, interestingly, when I talked about all this down zoning, land values still continue to go up. And I think it's partially kind of without enough supply, right? Then the demand drives the cost.
Mm-hmm.
So land values, you don't have enough ability to build. And so the demand drives the cost of land. Right. But interestingly, when we start to get into the solutions, when either the state through some of its streamlining or the city tries to address the downzoning and create density bonus and create incentive to build, immediately the land cost goes up. When you rezone, the market's like, oh, you can build more now, so I'm going to charge more. And so there's this tension of wanting to upzone and make it easier to build and undo all this slow growth. But then the value capture, if you will, is going into the landowner's pocket, because they're like, now my land is worth more. I'm going to sell it for more. So you're still having this affordability. This is more recent, but huge insurance premiums, we know. And I should note, it's for affordable housing developers. It's for homeowners. It's for everybody. Our insurance premiums are making it riskier.
Jenna, you're talking through cost of housing. A lot of different aspects of that, from insurance to land value, but also the policy around housing. So downzoning and then upzoning, and then the culture around housing, which we know has been steeped in racism, but is now sort of part of how we think about wealth and how we build wealth as homeowners. And so I would say that's more cultural. So between this resource side and policy side and cultural side of housing, what are some of the levers or opportunities to help maybe streamline the process to get through and cut through some of these obstacles?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I talked a lot about the slow growth movement and what's happened with downzoning. What's interesting that's been happening, it almost ties into like the REAP stuff and what the state started coming down. And I think, definitely under this governor and the legislature said, cities, you are not doing enough to address the housing crisis. And the state can exercise power over local land use. And I'm not going to get into all the consternation and kind of friction that it's caused between states and cities, but I want to lift up what the state has done. Created a whole host of new and stronger density bonuses, saying you're going to get streamlining if you are doing either some portion of affordable housing or 100% affordable. And that streamlining also is addressing CEQA. It's really, it also, I think importantly, gives some of the local electeds cover, right? The local electeds can be like, hey, we hear you. Nothing we could do. The state tied her hands behind her back. And it's a little cynical, but it was needed, right? It was needed. And so I want to lift up what the state has done. And then at the city level, in LA City, Mayor Bass, her executive directive 1 was unbelievable. She streamlined affordable housing. If you're doing 100% affordable, we're going to get you your entitlements and your permits each within 60 days, and created a whole host of certainty there. And so you're seeing the state create capacity and make it easier for projects to move forward. And then in LA City, you saw the city pick up and then push that even further along in its commitment to address these land use and zoning and entitlement challenges. And I think those have been really important and hopeful. We're
Yeah.
making it easier, but one challenge I'd lift up, and we're kind of in it now, is a lot of projects that have been entitled under this streamlining and density bonus, the lending community hasn't quite caught up.
Mm.
They're like, you got entitled for this, but we haven't seen this before. This 100% affordable, 80% of the units at 80% area median income, 20% 120. I don't know how I feel about funding this. So clear the pathway, get entitled more quickly. It then has to move from entitlement to construction. I think that's an important note that we're
Yes.
paying attention to. And I think that's where some of the work with LA for LA picks up and trying to then help push prototypes on the financing side.
These state and local policies have done a lot to drive projects into the pipeline. And what you're talking about is like, how do you get them from pipeline to construction? Executive Directive 1 that Mayor Bass put out at the beginning of her term helped streamline construction. And what I read was within the first year, nearly 150 projects were entitled with 10,000 affordable units, which is extraordinary to get more than that.
But there's over in May, there were 20,000 units in the pipeline under 81. So it had been over a year in May, but
Yeah.
it's about a year and 4 months, 5 months.
You're right. And we had talked about how every year LA needs to be constructing 56,000 additional housing units. That's inclusive of affordable. And you're saying that 20,000 were entitled or permitted, within that first year. When we're talking about making that transition from entitled to constructed, there's a lot of financing work that goes on in there. And Mayor Bass created the LA for LA program, which brings together resources from the private sector, the philanthropic sector, and the public sector to fuel housing production. So since its rollout and its purpose of taking projects that are entitled to fruition, have you seen it work towards achieving its potential?
Yeah.
And what has that been?
Yeah. So LA for LA is really a partnership meant to focus on, they're calling it 4Ps, public, private, philanthropic partnership. So 4Ps, not just 3. And really the idea was focusing on identifying creative solutions that can be scaled, kind of pushing on all of these partners to show what's possible, and to move and bend in ways maybe that they hadn't prior. And so LA for LA was brought in to kind of find some projects that are at that cusp, almost there, and see how we could push them to the finish line with these, 4Ps. Really what they're looking at doing, there's been a couple pilot projects that have already rolled out, is create kind of 3 funds. One fund is like a low interest loan they call PRA, program related income, which is what philanthropy does. One that would be more of a grant. Some of these projects just need a little shot of cash grant. And then the third is a guarantee fund that we're looking to structure. And I say we, I'm not technically working there, but have been helping to set up this concept. So 3 funds. The initiatives are more about testing boundaries and models, again, across these 4Ps of how housing is delivered.
And you talked about the Guarantee Initiative, which I know is very dear and close to your heart. And you've been working on this for quite some time. When we first met, you talked about this. I just thought it was so fascinating. And I'm not a low income housing finance expert, and very few people are. So typically a traditional developer will partner with affordable housing developers or specialists to understand how to leverage the right incentives to make projects work. And one tool in this space has been vouchers. Listeners might be aware of Section 8 housing vouchers, where renters can bring that voucher to an eligible rental, and that helps subsidize that rent for that specific renter. Now, I know you're going to talk about the mechanics of this, but what I thought was interesting is that developers are building affordable housing, but how they're able to underwrite that can't be dependent on these renter-chosen voucher programs, because that's in the renter's power to be able to choose where they go. So how can an underwriter ensure and make a project financeable by knowing that there will be enough of these Section 8 vouchers that come specifically to this project? And that was the concept. And I know you're going to speak about it way more eloquently, but can you sort of talk through vouchers in general, how they're used, why they're really hard to underwrite, and the dynamics around?
Yeah. So, traditionally, when I say traditionally, since the 80s when the low-income housing tax credit program was created, our affordable housing models have been kind of, you use tax credits, ideally 9% tax credits, but there's 4%, there's bonds, there's a whole cottage industry of delivering affordable housing. It's not that it's not working, but there's all the things we talked about, cost of housing going up, land use challenges, plus there's just not enough of the funding. Like our housing crisis is so giant. Even without all the challenges, there's just not enough of that public subsidy to deliver the amount of affordable housing we need. I think another piece that's important to understand is when we're trying to serve our lowest of low income, our most vulnerable populations, even those low income housing tax credit deals, there's just not enough rent in there to make it work. And so we rely on operating subsidies. So the way the model has adjusted, particularly for permanent supportive housing, is the reliance has been on what's called project-based vouchers. PHAs are generally allowed to project-base 30% of their overall voucher allocation. And what's important about the project-based voucher is it's tied to the unit, not the person. So if you're doing an affordable housing project, you can go to a lender and say, hey, the housing authority gave me 40 project-based vouchers. So I can tell you of my 100 units, 40 of them are going to have this $2,400 a month rent through this project-based voucher. Instead of the extremely low income rent, by the way, is like $500 a month. So this is a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
And the bank will say, great, we're going to underwrite to that rent. Let's go. So we are pretty much out of our allocation. We have hit our 30% cap in LA, city and county for the most part. And so how do we deliver this lowest income housing? We got a problem. We don't have these operating subsidies. That's one piece of the problem. The other piece, just general, is we talked about all these amazing streamlining programs.
Mm-hmm.
Density bonuses from the state and LA City EV1, these TOC, Transit Communities Density Bonus projects. And people are going, I'm going to include some amount of extremely low income units in my project, or I'm going to deliver a project that's 80% AMI. But the reality is, because it's so expensive to build with some of these, there's a little question about, are they going to pencil on the end? Are they going to be able to really be an operable project? So what some developers are figuring out is, I'm going to try to target people with the Section 8 voucher. So I can still meet the income requirement. Somebody who has a voucher is very low income, right? You're only getting it if you're very low income. So you're going to meet the income requirement, but it's going to bring more rent if I get this voucher tenant. So we're seeing that happen, but the banks aren't underwriting to that. So give me the loan. The banks be like, how do we know? You can't guarantee that. These folks have choice. And so the premise is, how do we turn these into financial instruments that will take these entitled projects and move them into construction more quickly? What we were looking at is creation for the tenant-based programs of a guaranteed fund that would say, look, we would start with philanthropy and say, we will guarantee the rent differential, right? Mm-hmm. There's a covenanted rent and say that's $550 a month. And there's the voucher and that's $2,400. And we will guarantee that differential for some amount of these units so that if there's a problem and they can't make their loan payment, we've got it covered. So that was the premise. And what I got to do for a couple months is some research, just trying to size this and structure it. Mm-hmm. Because no one's just going to say, sure, we'll just cover that difference. I mean, that's not, the program. It's the guarantor wants to know, how do I make sure you never need that guarantee?
Right.
So I interviewed 25 lenders, property managers, developers that work in this space. I looked at a lot of data from the city's housing authority, HACLA, and the county's housing authority, which is through LACTA, the LA Community Development Authority. So I looked at the data, and what it can tell you is people who target, including housing authority in LA, who's buying units, if you're targeting voucher holders in your own pro forma to make your project pencil, 20% is reasonable, about 15 to 25%. You could feel comfortable saying, if I've got 100 units, I'm going to rely on the fact that I could put 20% of those to have voucher holders. Wouldn't go too much higher than that. We also know that in any given month, there are 1,000 voucher holders in the city of LA looking for a unit because of turnover. Wow. And we learned that 40% of vouchers are taken back by the housing authority because people cannot find a unit within not just the initial timeline, they get extensions. Mm-hmm. What we know is there's demand, there's a wait list, there's people looking every month, and those people are having a hard time finding a unit.
Yeah. And that should add some surety to the underwriter that there's actually this demand market so that when you're underwriting that you're going to have these choice vouchers at your development, you know that 20% of them will come.
I mean, I still think you need to look at things like some of the concern, and their rightful concerns, is a lot of these density bonus projects say are doing no parking. That might make your unit less attractive. Or where is the unit? And is it near certain amenities? I mean, you still need to underwrite these projects. So going forward, taking this data and understanding there is demand, we're still saying this program would, need some underwriting, and we would create underwriting guidelines to make sure we're picking projects that we feel confident you wouldn't need the guarantee in the end. One other piece I looked at, we did some financial analysis, and we looked at 3 prototype projects. If you could underwrite 20% of those units, or whatever the right percent is, at voucher level rents, does it make a difference?
Yeah.
Right? That extra loan. And the answer was, oh yeah, it provided a lot of extra loan. And this was, my public sector brain doesn't look at yield on cost, but lenders and developers do. It boosted yield on cost significantly.
Wow.
So I think it's important to know we can show ways to ensure you have the demand. It also matters economically. It will matter to these projects and help them move forward. The last thing we wanted to look at in this research, in a good way, but in a way to be cautious about the density bonuses and inclusionary and streamlining, has brought a lot of new players into the affordable market. How do we make sure we're protecting from some bad actors who aren't going to provide the kind of high quality affordable housing that we need, who aren't going to be the slumlords of tomorrow? And so we're looking at structuring this guarantee fund program to make sure that there is a service provider partner through some kind of what's called like a master rental subsidy agreement, where those 20% of the units are leased, if you will, by a service provider partner who would then source and provide housing that source your tenant-based voucher holders and provide housing navigation to them, but also make sure there's some connection into a broader system.
Right. So like an intermediary that reduces risk on both sides. Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay.
All right.
We talked at a super high level. Like, what does the housing crisis look like in California? What is the state and the city doing to help out? And then we talked at a really granular level. What is one solution in this guarantee fund that can help us get from permitted projects to constructed projects? And your superpower has been creating these processes and expectations and teams that are able to actually fulfill these promises and these objectives. Can you talk about your transition to consulting with Hornstock Housing and Community Development Strategies, and what you're looking forward to the most, whether in this consulting work or in the work that you do in LA, and what keeps you optimistic about working in this very challenging field of housing?
Yeah. So I launched my consulting practice officially mid-July. So it's only been 3 months. And what I found is that I'm kind of a boutique consultant. I'm really trying to continue what we call my superpower, which is like taking big ideas, programs, and policies, and then figuring out a path, not just to implement them, but to create infrastructure so that these programs take off, can grow, and adapt. I'm working with a pretty creative developer doing these 100% affordable projects that are privately financed, helping them scale up, helping them make sure their projects are successful, and helping them move into new cities. I'm about to actually launch work with the LA Community College District that has $500 million in bonds to develop housing for their students. But as a community college district, they don't have background in doing housing. It's different to build schools and classrooms and facilities than it is to build housing, which has a whole set of other operating requirements. So helping them lift up both a strategy, like how are we getting into this space, and how do we make sure we protect our general fund and create housing that's sustainable, but also what is the structure for us doing this? And then ideally, because I've been able to partner with LA on some grants, ideally we'll be lifting up this guarantee fund and actually doing some more work on rental subsidies. So the theme in this boutique consulting, I think, is continuing on this kind of scalable solutions with infrastructure to grow. And it's really a marriage of all the P's, the public, the private, philanthropy. And so I feel I'm excited and hopeful that I can continue to have a similar impact as a consultant. It's hard to keep working in affordable housing, but I stay optimistic because I see the results. There are great minds and committed hearts working in this space across the sectors, in every aspect of affordable housing. I'm grateful every day to be part of those circles. And when we bring all these minds together and we bring the capital and the power together, then we do see results. And so I just stay focused and committed to that.
Thanks for tuning in to Building Better Cities. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to hit subscribe so you never miss another episode. And if you could help spread the word by sharing with someone, it would mean so much to us. To learn more about our work, check out buildingbettercities.com. We're excited to keep the conversation going. So until next time, let's keep building better cities together.